could have been our children. But it was Southport. It was Bebe, 6 years old. Elsie, 7. Alice, 9. Back in August, I said there would be a time for questions, but that first justice had to be done, and that above all, we must not interfere with the work of the police, the prosecutors, and the delivery of that justice. Well, yesterday, thankfully, a measure of justice was done, but it won't bring those girls back to their families, and it won't remove the trauma from the lives of those who were injured. Their lives will never be the same. So before I turn to the questions that must now be answered, for the families and the nation, I first want to recognise their unimaginable grief, because I know the whole country grieves for them. The tragedy of the Southport killings must be a line in the sand for Britain. We must make sure the names of those 3 young girls are not associated with the vile perpetrator, but instead with a fundamental change in how Britain protects its citizens and its children. In pursuit of that, we must, of course, ask and answer difficult questions, questions that should be far-reaching, unburdened by cultural or institutional sensitivities, and driven only by the pursuit of justice. That is what we owe the families. The responsibility for this barbaric act lies, as it always does, with the vile individual who carried it out. But that is no comfort. And more importantly, it is no excuse. And so, as part of the inquiry launched by the Home Secretary yesterday, I will not let any institution of the state deflect from their failure. Failure which, in this case, frankly, leaps off the page. For example, the perpetrator was referred to the PREVENT programme on 3 separate occasions. In 2019, once, and in 2021, twice. Yet on each of these occasions, a judgment was made that he did not meet the threshold for intervention, a judgment that was clearly wrong and which failed those families. And I acknowledge that here today. Throughout this case, to this point, we have only been focused on justice. If this trial had collapsed because I or anyone else had revealed crucial details while the police were investigating, while the case was being built, while we were awaiting a verdict, then the vile individual who committed these crimes would have walked away a free man. The prospect of justice destroyed for the victims and their families. I would never do that, and nobody would ever forgive me if I had. That is why the law of this country forbade me or anyone else from disclosing details sooner. Nonetheless, it is now time for those questions. And the first of those is whether this was a terrorist attack. The blunt truth here is that this case is a sign. Britain now faces a new threat. Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety, sometimes inspired by traditional terrorist groups, but fixated on that extreme violence, seemingly for its own sake. Now, it may well be that people like this are harder to spot, but we can't shrug our shoulders and accept that. We can't have a national security system that fails to tackle people who are a danger to our values, our security, our children. We have to be ready to face every threat. And when I look through the details of this case, the extreme nature of the violence, the meticulous plan to attack young children in a place of joy and safety, violence clearly intended to terrorize, then I understand why people wonder what the word terrorism means. And so if the law needs to change to recognize this new and dangerous threat, then we will change it, and quickly. And we will also review our entire counter-extremist system to make sure we have what we need to defeat it. Now, that work is already underway. I've tasked Sir David Anderson Casey, the new Independent Prevent Commissioner, to hold this system to account, to shine a light into its darkest corners, so the British people can have confidence that action will follow words. But I have to say, to face up to this new threat, there are also bigger questions. Questions such as how we protect our children from the tidal wave of violence freely available online. Because you can't tell me that the material this individual viewed before committing these murders should be accessible on mainstream social media platforms, that with just a few clicks, people can watch video after horrific video, videos that in some cases are never taken down. No, that cannot be right. But it's not just the nightmares of the online world, because when you wake from a nightmare, the first thing you do is reassure yourself with reality. But for far too many people, the state of our society no longer does that. Now, people will say this is all because of immigration, or all because of funding cuts. But in truth, neither tells us anything like the full story, or explains this case properly. No, this goes deeper. A growing sense that the rights and responsibilities that we owe to one another, the set of unwritten rules that hold a nation together, have in recent years been ripped apart. Children who've stopped going to school since the pandemic. Young people who've opted out of work or education. More and more people retreating into parallel lives, whether through failures of integration or just a country slowly turning away from itself. Wounds that politics, for all that it may have contributed, must try to heal. Thirdly, there are also questions about the accountability of the Whitehall and Westminster system, a system that is far too often driven by circling the institutional wagons, that does not react until justice is either hard won by campaigners or until appalling tragedies like this finally spur a degree of action. Time and again we see this pattern, and people are right to be angry about it. I'm angry about it. Southport must be a line in the sand. So nothing will be off the table in this inquiry. Nothing. And most importantly, it will lead to change. I know people will be watching right now, and they'll be saying, we've heard all this before, the promises, the sorrow, the inquiry that comes and goes, an inability to change that, frankly, has become the oxygen of wider conspiracy. And we've seen that throughout this case. A suggestion that there has been a cover-up. I want to put on record that yesterday's guilty verdict only happened because hundreds, if not thousands, of dedicated public servants worked towards it, many of whom endured absolutely harrowing circumstances, particularly in the police and the Crown Prosecution Service. That is their job. They are brilliant at it. But we should never forget their service to our country. Law and order depend on them. And yet I'm under no illusions that until the wider state shows the country it can change, not just what it delivers for people, but also its culture, then this atmosphere of mistrust will remain. So I want to be crystal clear in front of the British people today. We will leave no stone unturned. I was the prosecutor who first spotted failures in grooming cases in my institution, the CPS, 14 years ago. And I was the prosecutor who first did something about it by bringing the rape gangs in Rochdale to justice. And so my approach as Prime Minister will be no different. If any shortcomings are now holding back the ability of this country to keep its citizens and its children safe, I will find them and I will root them out. Because when it comes to justice, the failure to be transparent is not only disgraceful on its own terms, it is also the enemy of strong communities. It spreads suspicion more widely and allows division to win. I remember when this happened, in those dark days of the summer. And I remember that, like now, the whole country grieved for Southport. But I also remember how it was profoundly moved by their example. Because even as that community faced an unimaginable evil, even as they had to endure mindless violence, bricks and bottles thrown at their community, their businesses, their mosque, police officers attacked, including those who were on the scene responding to this vile murder. Even despite all of that, they chose to come together. They chose to pick up the pieces of their lives. They chose to rebuild, brick by brick, side by side. Strangers no longer strangers, a community. This country has no shortage of empathy for the people of Southport. I know that. But in the face of such darkness and tragedy, what we really should do is follow their example. That is what we need to face this new threat. But also something more. Because national renewal isn't just about public services or the economy. It's about turning us back towards ourselves, giving people confidence in a shared future, so people can once again see the strength and power in themselves and in this nation. But that can only begin today, by holding up the mirror and facing what we see. So wherever this inquiry goes, we will follow it. No matter the boats it will rock, no matter the vested interests it will threaten, we won't hide. But then, most importantly of all, we will act. Because this time it will be different. Southport will be a line in the sand. We will honour those 3 little girls and deliver not just justice, but the change that the people and families of Southport deserve. Thank you. I will now take a number of questions from the media, starting with Vicky Young from the BBC.
Prime Minister, you are a person with years of experience as a senior prosecutor. Do you really need a public inquiry to tell you that the system needs to change? And isn't there the possibility that that delay could mean that other dangerous cases are missed in the meantime?
Well, I think we need a public inquiry to answer all of the questions that the families, the people of Southport and the country have about this case, and to ensure that no stone is unturned, that every failure is exposed and dealt with. I also think we need an inquiry because we are dealing with a new cohort, a different threat, this individualised extreme violence, and we have to have the laws and framework in place to deal with it. But I accept your challenge. We shouldn't wait until the end of the inquiry before we start the change. And that's why already there's been a review of what happened with Prevent and the findings and learnings from that, so that the mistakes that were made then would not be made today. That is really important in reassuring the public. Why we've appointed a commissioner to look into that whole part of the apparatus, and why we will get on with some of the work we need to get on with changing, for example, the law when it comes to the framework for dealing with extreme violence. So we do need the inquiry so we have the full picture, full accountability, and every single question that the families have is properly answered in the proper way. But we need to get on with the change in the meantime, and to reassure the public that every step is being taken to protect their children. Thank you. Beth Rigby, Sky News.
Beth Rigby, Sky News, thank you. Prime Minister, it now emerges the perpetrator was known to the authorities and had been referred to Prevent, the anti-terrorism programme, 3 times. He'd had contact with the police, the courts, the justice, the youth system and mental health services. It's a catastrophic failure of the state to protect those young girls. Do you acknowledge that if that information had come out when the riots were happening, it would have provoked further outrage by the public, so you withheld information? Is that true? And do you acknowledge that whatever happens now, whatever public inquiry you carry out, this will hugely undermine trust from the public in the authorities and your government? Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Let me be clear. Responsibility for the disorder and the violence lies with those that perpetrated it. We need to be really clear about that. But let me address the facts as you put them to me. There has been a failure here, and I don't intend to let any institution of the state deflect from their failures, and I acknowledge that readily here. Yes, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice in a case such as this. But you know and I know that it would not have been right to disclose those details. The only losers, if the details had been disclosed, would be the victims and the families, because it ran the risk the trial would collapse. I'm never going to do that. Never going to do that, because they deserve that justice. And only by having the rules in place can that justice be delivered, as a measure of it now has. And I wouldn't be forgiven if I had. Those are not just my choices, though it is a choice I would make. It is also the law of the land. That is why I couldn't disclose the details. It's why others couldn't disclose the details. It's why all of you as journalists couldn't disclose the details, because the same laws applied to you just as they applied to me. And it's really important that we make that clear. But the purpose of the rule is to protect the justice that the families and the victims are entitled to. I think that's the right thing. It is now right, having got to this stage, that the questions are asked and the answers are given, which is why we've taken the course of an inquiry, but also why between now and the conclusion of the inquiry, we will happily answer any questions that are put to us. But that is why, notwithstanding that, yes, I was being kept updated, of course, I did not disclose anything that would collapse the trial and defeat justice in this case. And I don't think anybody could ever have looked the victims and their families in the eye if they'd ever done that. Thank you, Beth. Can I have Paul Brand, please, from ITV?
Paul Brand from ITV. Thank you, Prime Minister. All of us, as you say, as journalists, understand the risk of contempt of court, of prejudicing a trial, but we live in a different age now, don't we, where misinformation and disinformation spreads at lightning speed online. I was in Southport on the day of the attacks. There was a short window in which information could have been released before charge, before any risk of prejudicing a trial. Why didn't you do that? And do you think it was a mistake not to provide that detail then?
Firstly, let me address part of your... Look, it is true that we live in a different age in that information is now available online as well as offline. And I understand the frustration of all, but including some journalists who observe the rules and don't report what they know because they know that the law doesn't permit it and it runs the risk of collapsing a trial, only to see information online that doesn't appear to be following the same rules. And that is not acceptable. That has to be addressed and will be part of what we will be looking at, because that can't be right. But in relation to the central thrust of your question, the importance of the rule about not disclosing this information is to ensure that the trial can take place and that where an individual is guilty, they're held to account, as has now happened in this case. And that is why the law carefully restricts what can be said by anyone, not just me as Prime Minister, but anybody in these circumstances. And it is done to protect the family and their victims. That is the right thing. And that is what the law requires. It's also the choice I would make to ensure that my first thoughts are about justice for the victims and their families. That, for me, is first and foremost. Yes, we can answer questions, and we are now doing so with this inquiry and everything that will happen before the end of that inquiry. That is quite right. But it is also right that the families who've been through unimaginable grief at least have the comfort now of an outcome in this particular case. And you would be putting very different questions to me if I had disclosed information and we were now faced with a decision that the trial had just collapsed and the families would never get justice. You would rightly be challenging me very, very hard about why I had disclosed information. Thank you very much, Paul. Chris from GB News.
Chris Hope, GB News. Prime Minister, given what we know now about the terror link and how it's kept from the public, do you now regret blaming the far right for all those protests last summer? Was it a far right issue, or were some people entitled to be concerned and upset, not the rioters, of course?
Responsibility for the violence lies with them that perpetrated it. I was in Southport the day after these terrible murders. I was acknowledging and thanking the frontline police officers and ambulance who had been at the scene. You can imagine what they had been through. They were back at work the next day. They were saying it was just their job. I could see in their eyes the impact it had had on them, what they had to deal with, what they had to see, how they endured that. As I arrived back in London, those same officers were putting their riot gear on and having bricks thrown at them. Those same officers. I don't think anybody can justify that, nor should they attempt to do so. Thank you, Chris. Harry from The Sun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sorry to labour this point, but I think it's important. All summer we were repeatedly told that the Stockport attack was not terror-related, wasn't being treated as terror-related. That wasn't true. Because in October, the monster was charged with a terror offence. Now, information was put into the public domain then that didn't collapse the trial. It didn't jeopardise justice. It was just months later. Now, you say you knew about the ricin and the Al-Qaeda bomb manual and it was known to the authorities. Was that, did you know about that personally at the same time the public, the press, and you and the police were saying this is not terror-related? Because I think that's the nub of the issue and that's what's upset people. You say you couldn't speak out publicly, that you couldn't do that. But didn't the public have a right to know, not least the neighbours who had ricin being produced on their street? Surely they had a right to know.
Well, I think there are two separate and important issues there, Harry. The first is on the question of terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. And my concern in this case is that we have clearly got an example of extreme violence, individualised violence, that we have to protect our children from and our citizens from. And it is a new threat. It's not what we would have usually thought of as terrorism when definitions were drawn up, when guidelines were put in place, when the framework was put in place. And we have to recognise that here today, because I think most people would say, looking at the facts of this case, it's clearly extreme violence, it's clearly intended to terrorise. And I completely accept and understand that, and that is my view. Therefore, we have to make sure that the law and the framework for responding is appropriate to the new threat that we face. And there we will make whatever changes are necessary in the law to deal with it. On the second point, yes, of course I was kept up to date with the facts as they were emerging. That is usual practice. But just like you, as a journalist, I had to observe the law of the land. It was not my personal decision to withhold this information, any more than it was a journalist's personal decision not to print or write about it. That is the law of the land that is in place for the reasons I've set out, to protect the integrity of the system, to ensure that the victims and their families get the justice that they deserve. Thank you, Harry. And Jason from the Mail.
Thanks, PM. Jason Gross from the Daily Mail. It sounds from what you're saying like you personally consider this to have been a terrorist attack in the ordinary sense of the word. Is that right? And also, it sounds like you don't think that this is a one-off. Should people be worried? And are we going to need further protections in schools, youth centres? Because this guy seems to have had some sort of obsession with school massacres.
Well, thank you for raising that, because I think this is a really central issue, because, as I say, this is extreme violence, clearly intended to terrorise, and my concern is that because it is different to the sort of behaviour we've associated with terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and there are plenty of other examples, which tended to be more organised in groups with a clear political ideology and motive. Because it's not that, it is a new and different threat, it doesn't fit as well as it should within our framework, within our toolbox. And that is what we've got to change. That is the urgent question that has to be addressed. And it's one that has to be addressed before the conclusion of the inquiry. And it's why we've already done the learning from the prevent mistakes. But it is that cohort, I do think it's new. You've seen versions of it in America with some of the mass shootings in schools. It is not an isolated, ghastly example. It is, in my view, an example of a different kind of threat. And that is why I'm absolutely so determined that we will rise to that challenge and make sure that our law, our response is capable, appropriate, and can deal with that sort of threat. But that is my concern, that is my thinking, that this is a new threat, individualised, extreme violence, obsessive, often following online viewing of material from all sorts of different sources. It is not a one-off, it is something that we all need to understand and have a shared undertaking to deal with within our society. And that is not just the laws on terrorism, the framework on terrorism, there's also the laws on what we can access online. We still have rules in place in this country about what you can see at a cinema. And yet online, you can access no end of material. We have to ensure that we can rise to this new challenge, and that is what I'm determined to do. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.